He is the ultimate, unstoppable protector of modern cinema, the towering, relentless father who tore apart entire criminal empires to save his family. With a single, gravelly threat delivered over a telephone, he redefined the action genre. The world knows a particular set of skills, his intimidating 6'4" frame, and his reputation as a man who can survive absolutely any catastrophe. But behind the billion-dollar box office and the invincible cinematic mask lies a reality that violently shatters the tough guy illusion. At 73 years old, Liam Neeson is a man running desperately from a crushing, unbearable silence. Behind the Hollywood legend stands a deeply broken husband who survived the most agonizing irony a human heart can ever endure. A man who possesses every weapon on screen, but who is completely, tragically powerless in the real world to save the absolute love of his life from a freak, invisible accident. A grieving father who was forced to stand in a cold hospital room and make the unthinkable, soul-crushing decision to let his own wife quietly slip away into the dark. Why did a distinguished, Academy Award-nominated Shakespearean actor transform into a violent action star in his late 50s? Was it pursuit of money or a desperate, exhausting attempt to physically numb the agony of an empty house? And what is the terrifying cost of playing a savior for the world when you couldn't save your own universe? Before we answer these questions, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the lonely giant at 73, you must first know the working-class boy who learned how to take a punch. The fractured streets, the broken nose, and the gentle giant. There's a manufactured, highly stylized illusion in Hollywood regarding the men who play our most terrifying enforcers. We are conditioned to believe that an actor who flawlessly projects violence on screen must naturally possess a dark, aggressive soul. We look at the towering, broad-shouldered silhouette of Liam Neeson, and we assume he was born with fists of iron, ready to conquer the world through sheer, unapologetic intimidation. But true intimidation is often a mask, and sometimes the most imposing, heavily armored men are simply the ones who are forced to build the thickest walls to protect an incredibly fragile, deeply sensitive heart. William John Neeson was born on June 7, 1952, in a profoundly working-class town of Ballymena, County Antrim, in Northern Ireland. He arrived in a world that was defined not by Hollywood glamour, but by the smell of diesel, the relentless grind of physical labor, and a deeply fractured, highly volatile society. His mother, Catherine, worked as a cook, spent her days over hot stoves to feed her family. His father, Bernard, was a caretaker at a local primary school. They were a devoutly Catholic family living in a predominantly Protestant town, existing in the heavy, suffocating shadow of an era that would soon explode into a grueling, decades-long period of ethno-nationalist conflict known simply as the Troubles. For a young boy growing up in Northern Ireland during the mid-20th century, the environment demanded absolute, unyielding toughness. Vulnerability was not a luxury a working-class boy could afford. You had to learn how to defend yourself before you even learned how to read. At just 9 years old, Liam slipped his hands into a pair of heavy, worn-out leather gloves. He stepped into a local boxing ring. He did not box because he loved violence. He boxed because, in the rough, unpredictable streets of Ballymena, knowing how to take a punch and stay on your feet was the ultimate, necessary currency of survival. For years, the young boy dedicated his life to the brutal, exhausting discipline of the sport. He became an accomplished amateur boxer, winning regional titles. During one particularly brutal fight when he was 15, his nose was violently fractured. It healed imperfectly, leaving him with a distinct, slightly crooked and rugged facial geography that would one day make him a global cinematic icon. He was building the physical resume of a bruiser. He grew to a massive 6 feet, 4 inches tall. He looked like a man who could effortlessly clear out a crowded pub. But inside this towering, heavily bruised physical vessel lived a boy of startling, almost heartbreaking sensitivity. While his peers idolized fighters and soldiers, young Liam was secretly harboring a deeply artistic, quietly observant soul. When he was 11 years old, an English teacher handed him a script for a school play. Liam accepted the role, but not out of a burning ambition for the spotlight. He later admitted, with a charming, self-deprecating honesty, that he only auditioned because the lead female role was being played by a girl he had a massive crush on. But the moment the towering, awkward, broken-nosed boy stepped onto the creaking wooden floorboards of that makeshift stage, a profound psychological alchemy took place. The theater was a revelation. It was the only room in Northern Ireland where the invisible, deadly lines of sectarian conflict simply did not matter. On stage, he was not a poor Catholic boy from Ballymena. He was not a boxer bracing for the next punch. He was whoever the script demanded him to be. The heavy, protective armor he wore in the streets could finally, safely be taken off. I never felt entirely comfortable in my own skin, Liam later confessed, describing the deep, existential awkwardness of his youth. But on stage, behind the words of someone else, I finally felt like I could breathe. It was an escape. It was an escape. Listen to the quiet desperation in that admission for the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who grew up in harsh, unforgiving environments, who had to hide their true passions, their poetry, and their sensitivities just to survive the grueling expectations of their fathers and their peers. Liam's discovery of the theater is a breathtaking moment of empathy. He wasn't acting for applause. He was acting to find a safe harbor. But a safe harbor does not pay the bills. As Liam transitioned into his early 20s, the romantic dream of becoming a professional actor was buried beneath the crushing, unavoidable mathematics of working-class survival. He enrolled in Queen's University Belfast to study physics and computer science, hoping to secure a stable, respectable career. But the academic structure felt entirely alien to his soul. He dropped out. He returned to the grueling, blue-collar reality of his hometown. He took a job operating a forklift at the local Guinness brewery. He worked as a truck driver. He worked as an assistant to an architect. Imagine the incredibly visceral, cinematic reality of his life during those years. The man who would eventually earn $20 million a picture, the man who would be knighted by the Queen and nominated for Academy Awards, was spending his 20s covered in factory dust, gripping the steering wheel of a heavy truck in the freezing Irish rain. He was a giant, quietly moving boxes in a warehouse, entirely invisible to the world. But the siren song of the stage never stopped calling to him. In 1976, at the age of 24, he made a decision that required infinitely more courage than stepping into a boxing ring. He walked away from the steady paycheck of the brewery and joined the Lyric Players Theatre in Belfast. For the next several years, Liam Neeson poured his absolute soul into grueling, impoverished trenches of the theatre circuit. He moved to Dublin. He moved to London. He performed Shakespeare. He learned the delicate, precise, and highly intellectual craft of classical acting. He had successfully escaped the forklift. But as he began to transition from the stage to the screen in the early 1980s, the towering actor was about to discover that the film industry is an incredibly shallow, prejudiced machine. When casting directors in London and eventually Hollywood looked at Liam Neeson, they completely ignored his classical training. They ignored the profound, poetic depth in his eyes. They saw a man who was 6'4". They saw a broken nose. They heard a thick, heavy, working-class Northern Irish accent. The industry did not see a leading man. They saw a thug. They saw a monster. They saw a brute. Throughout the 1980s, Liam was repeatedly, frustratingly typecast in roles that required him to use his physical size to intimidate others. He played a mute, hulking knight in the 1981 fantasy film Excalibur. He played silent henchmen. He played violent adversaries. He was a highly trained Shakespearean artist trapped inside the body of a gladiator. He was approaching his late 30s, and the terrifying realization was beginning to set in that he might spend the rest of his cinematic life entirely misunderstood, relegated to background, and never truly given a chance to show the world the gentle, aching heart that lived inside the giant. But the universe, operating on its own magnificent delayed timeline, was quietly preparing a script that would completely obliterate every preconceived notion Hollywood held about him. As he crossed into his 40s, a legendary, visionary director was desperately searching for an actor who could project immense, towering physical authority, but whose eyes could simultaneously convey the deepest, most unbearable sorrow of the human condition. The longest, most frustrating wait of Liam Neeson's life was finally coming to an end, and a miracle called Schindler was waiting just over the horizon. The Late Awakening, the Schindler Miracle, and the Noble Anchor. There's a profound, almost agonizing cruelty to the concept of the late bloomer in Hollywood. The industry demands the explosive, unblemished perfection of youth. It wants its leading men to be discovered at 25, to rule the box office in their 30s, and to slowly, comfortably transition into legacy status by their 50s. To endure the grueling, merciless machinery of audition rooms and supporting roles into your 40s requires a psychological fortitude that very few human beings possess. You're forced to stand in the background, a towering 6'4" extra with a broken nose, watching younger, less experienced men receive the accolades, the applause, and the multi-million-dollar paychecks. By the early 1990s, Liam Neeson was nearing 40 years old. The boy who had driven a forklift in a brewery in Northern Ireland and spent nearly 2 decades mastering the complex, classical art of theater in London and Dublin. But the cinematic world remained stubbornly blind to his depth. He was consistently, aggressively typecast as a physical brute, the silent muscle standing menacingly behind the real star of the film. He was a man carrying a massive, profound ocean of emotional sensitivity inside his chest, but the universe only seemed interested in the size of his fists. But destiny, operating on its own magnificent, terrifying timeline, was quietly preparing the ultimate history-altering stage. In 1992, Liam moved back to the grueling, pure discipline of the theater. He accepted the lead role in a Broadway production of Eugene O'Neill's classic play, Anna Christie. It was a raw, deeply poetic, and emotionally exhausting role about an aging, broken-down sailor. Sitting in the darkened audience of that Broadway theater one evening, watching the towering Irishman pour his absolute, bleeding soul onto the stage, was a legendary director Steven Spielberg. Spielberg was in the agonizing, deeply personal process of casting the most important, terrifyingly significant film of his entire life, Schindler's List. He had spent years searching for the perfect actor to portray Oskar Schindler, the complex, morally ambiguous German industrialist who saved over 1,000 Jewish refugees during the absolute horror of the Holocaust. Spielberg needed a man who possessed immense, imposing physical authority, but whose eyes could simultaneously convey the deepest, most unbearable sorrow and moral awakening of the human condition. He did not need a polished Hollywood superstar. He needed a man who understood the heavy, crushing weight of survival. When Spielberg looked at Liam Neeson on that stage, the search was instantly over. Liam had the presence of a man who could command a room just by walking into it, Spielberg later reflected, describing the monumental casting decision. But he also had a gentleness, a profound, tragic empathy in his eyes. He was a giant, but he was a giant with a broken heart. A giant with a broken heart. Listen to the absolute, magnificent truth of that description. The broken nose, the working-class accent, the decades of being overlooked and dismissed as a thug, all of it had been a necessary, brutal preparation for the specific, immortal role. When Schindler's List premiered in 1993, it was not just a movie. It was a staggering, monumental cultural reckoning. The film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. And at 41 years old, the man who used to operate a forklift in Ballymena was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. He delivered a performance of such profound, devastating humanity that it permanently, irrevocably altered the trajectory of his existence. He was no longer the silent brute in the background. He was the undisputed, soulful leading man of his generation. He had finally, magnificently arrived. But the universe, in its infinite, beautiful generosity, did not just hand him the crown of profession in the early 1990s. It handed him something infinitely more valuable and profoundly more rare. It handed him the absolute, undisputed love of his life. During the rehearsals for that exact same Broadway play, Anna Christie, in 1992, Liam was introduced to his co-star. Her name was Natasha Richardson. To understand the sheer, breathtaking poetry of their collision, you must understand the massive, almost unbridgeable chasm that separated their origins. Natasha was not just an actress. She was British theatrical royalty. She was the daughter of the legendary Oscar-winning actress Vanessa Redgrave and director Tony Richardson. She possessed a refined, elegant, and intensely intellectual pedigree. She had grown up surrounded by the absolute elite of the European artistic aristocracy. Liam, conversely, was a man carved from the rough, impoverished, and deeply fractured streets of Northern Ireland. He was a former amateur boxer who had learned how to throw a punch to survive the violent sectarian conflicts of his youth. On paper, the union between the elegant British aristocrat and the towering, working-class Irish brawler seemed completely, fundamentally absurd. But true love does not consult a resume, and it absolutely does not care about social class. From the very first moment they stepped on the stage together, the chemistry was an instantaneous, electric explosion. Natasha, who was married at the time, later confessed that working with Liam threw her entire world into absolute chaos. "I'd never had that kind of explosive chemistry situation with an actor or director," Natasha later admitted, completely dropping polite, restrained facade of her upbringing. "We just had this kind of wonderful, incredible dynamic. It was obvious to me that I was falling very much in love with him." For Liam, a man who had spent his entire life feeling slightly out of place, too sensitive for the boxing ring, too big for delicate roles, too rough for the polished Hollywood parties, Natasha was an absolute revelation. She did not look at him and see a rough, uneducated outsider. She saw the poet inside the giant. She saw his incredible intelligence, his deep, unwavering loyalty, and his profound, quiet gentleness. She provided him with the ultimate, unquestionable sanctuary he had been searching for his entire life. Following her divorce, Natasha and Liam were married in 1994. They purchased an incredibly beautiful, quiet farmhouse in upstate New York, far away from the exhausting, superficial machinery of Los Angeles. They welcomed 2 sons, Michael and Daniel. For the next 15 years, they built a life that completely defied the toxic, cynical expectations of celebrity romance. They were the ultimate, universally adored power couple, but they completely rejected the power. They preferred cooking dinners at home, raising their boys in the quiet woods, and supporting each other's fiercely brilliant theatrical careers. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men who spent the chaotic, restless decades of their youth searching for a place to belong, only to finally, miraculously find their absolute center of gravity in the arms of a good woman. Liam's transformation is deeply understood. Natasha did not just change his life. She was his life. She was his compass. She was his entire spring. As Liam transitioned through his 40s and into his 50s, he possessed a level of personal and professional peace that most men cannot even fathom. He was a wealthy, globally respected cinematic icon, and he was coming home every single night to the woman who had completely cured his loneliness. But the universe, which had taken 40 years to finally grant the giant his peace, was quietly preparing to exact the most terrifying, absolutely merciless toll imaginable. As the calendar turned toward the fateful year of 2009, the perfect, unbreakable sanctuary of the Neeson family was resting on a fault line. The man who had played a hero capable of saving thousands of lives on the silver screen was entirely unaware that he was about to face a nightmare where absolutely no amount of strength, no amount of fame, and no amount of begging could save the one person who mattered most. The ultimate protector was about to be completely, violently disarmed, and the longest, coldest, and most agonizing winter of his existence was waiting for him, silently, on a snow-covered mountain in Canada. the freak accident, the silent hemorrhage, and the unthinkable pact. There is a terrifying, universally ignored truth about the nature of human tragedy. Hollywood conditions us to believe that the end of a beautiful life will be announced by roaring thunder, dramatic orchestral music, and blinding explosions. But in reality, the most catastrophic, universe-shattering moments of our existence almost never arrive with a warning. They arrive disguised as a perfectly ordinary, sunlit afternoon. In March of 2009, Liam Neeson was 56 years old. He was working in Toronto, Canada, filming a quiet, tense drama called Chloe. He was a man standing at the absolute center of a beautiful, peaceful plateau. He had his magnificent career, his 2 teenage sons, Michael and Daniel, and his fierce, unconditionally loving wife, Natasha Richardson. They had been married for 15 flawless, deeply connected years. Just a few hundred miles away, Natasha was taking a brief, relaxing vacation at the Mont Tremblant ski resort in Quebec. She was taking a beginner's skiing lesson on a gentle, forgiving slope. What happened next is a sequence of events so mundane, so deceptively trivial, that it continues to haunt the nightmares of everyone who loved her. Natasha took a tumble. It was a simple, common fall on a beginner's hill. She was not wearing a helmet, but she didn't hit a tree, and she didn't fall off a cliff. She simply slipped and bumped her head on the packed snow. She didn't lose consciousness. She didn't bleed. She stood right back up, brushed the snow off her jacket, and laughed off the clumsy mistake with her instructor. She felt absolutely fine. When the ski patrol offered to call a paramedic just as a precaution, she politely waved them away. She walked back to her hotel room. A little while later, she picked up the phone and called her husband in Toronto. Liam answered the phone, entirely unaware that he was listening to the voice of his universe for the very last time, decades later. Recounting that brief, chillingly normal conversation, Liam's voice would break with the agonizing, heavy weight of a man replaying a ghost in his mind. "We spoke on the phone," Liam remembered softly, his voice reduced to a devastated whisper. She said, "Oh, darling, I've taken a tumble in the snow." That's how she described it. "I've taken a tumble in the snow." Listen to the breathtaking, agonizing innocence of that sentence. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who have lost a spouse to a sudden heart attack, an unexpected aneurysm, or a completely unforeseeable accident, the terrifying, deceptive calm of that phone call strikes a raw, bleeding nerve. You believe your loved one is safe. You believe you will see them for dinner. But beneath the surface of Natasha's skull, a silent, invisible, and absolutely lethal predator had been unleashed. She was experiencing what trauma surgeons refer to as the talk and die syndrome, an epidural hematoma. A torn blood vessel was quietly, methodically pooling blood inside her brain, building a catastrophic, suffocating pressure. A few hours after that cheerful phone call, the devastating headache arrived. Then came the confusion. Then the absolute collapse. She was rushed to a local hospital and eventually airlifted to a trauma center in Montreal. When Liam received the second phone call, the world as he knew it instantly, violently ended. He rushed to the airport, securing a flight to Montreal. When he arrived at the hospital, the scene he encountered was an absolute sterile nightmare. The doctors, speaking in hushed clinical tones, pulled a towering 6'4" giant into a small room. They put a glowing X-ray up on a light board. They looked at the man who had played Jedi Masters, legendary mentors, and invincible protectors, and they delivered a verdict that no amount of Hollywood magic could ever rewrite. They told him that Natasha's brain had been pushed against the side of her skull. She was brain dead. She was being kept alive entirely by artificial life support. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated psychological apocalypse of that exact moment. Liam Neeson, the man who possessed the physical presence of a gladiator, the actor who had made a fortune projecting absolute, commanding authority on screen, was completely, fundamentally powerless. He could not negotiate. He could not fight the doctors. He could not punch the air. He was just a helpless, broken husband, standing under fluorescent lights, watching the oxygen be mechanically pumped into the chest of the woman who had saved his soul 15 years ago. But amidst this crushing, paralyzing agony, a profound, incredibly heavy responsibility rested entirely on his shoulders. Years earlier, during a quiet, intimate conversation about the fragility of life, Liam and Natasha had made a sacred, terrifying pact. They promised each other that if either of them ever ended up in a vegetative state, relying on machines to breathe, the other would not let them suffer. They promised to pull the plug. It is one thing to make a philosophical promise in the safety of your living room. It is an entirely different, soul-crushing reality to actually walk into an intensive care unit and execute that promise. Liam walked into Natasha's hospital room. The room was filled with the rhythmic, terrifying hissing of the ventilator. He stood over the bed. He looked at the beautiful, elegant woman who had looked past his broken nose and his working-class accent to see the poet inside him. He bent his massive frame over the bed, gently kissed her forehead, and delivered a final, agonizing goodbye that absolutely shatters the human heart. I went into her and told her I loved her, Liam later revealed, sharing the most devastating, intimate moment of his entire existence. I said, "Sweetie, you're not coming back from this. You've banged your head. I don't know if you can hear me, but that's what's happened, and we're bringing you back to New York. All your family and friends will come." And that was more or less it. Sweetie, you're not coming back from this. For the audiences watching this, there is no cinematic dialogue ever written that can match the profound, bleeding dignity of a husband giving his wife the permission to leave. He did not beg her to stay for his own selfish comfort. He honored her spirit. He honored their pact. Natasha was flown back to New York City so her family could gather. And then Liam Neeson, the gentle giant from Northern Ireland, gave the order to turn off the machines. On March 18, 2009, at the age of 45, Natasha Richardson slipped quietly across the threshold. When the news broke, the global entertainment industry was completely paralyzed by shock. But for Liam, the loss was not a news story. It was an absolute, permanent amputation of his future. He was 56 years old. He was suddenly a single father to two grieving teenage boys. The sprawling farmhouse in upstate New York, which had been filled with laughter, theater scripts, and the warmth of a perfect marriage, was suddenly transformed into a freezing, echoing museum of ghosts. How does a man survive the sudden, violent erasure of his entire universe? When a heart is broken that completely, silence becomes the ultimate enemy. If Liam stayed in that quiet house, if he sat in a chair and allowed the memories of Natasha to catch up with him, the grief would have undoubtedly drowned him. He needed an escape. He needed a distraction so incredibly loud, so physically exhausting, and so completely consuming that his brain would not have the capacity to process the agonizing absence in his bed. The Shakespearean actor, the dignified Oscar-nominated artist, was about to make a completely baffling, shocking professional pivot. He was about to transform himself into the most lethal, relentless, and violent action star of the 21st century. He was going to pick up a gun, walk onto a movie set, and begin punishing his own body in a desperate, adrenaline-fueled attempt to numb the excruciating pain of a widower's reality. The action star paradox, the anesthetic of exhaustion, and the alchemy of pain. There is a specific, terrifying silence that descends upon a house when the funeral is finally over. For the first few days, the grieving are surrounded by the chaotic, comforting noise of logistics. The phone constantly rings. Friends deliver food. Relatives fill the living room with quiet whispers of condolence. But eventually, the guests have to go back to their own lives. The front door closes. The lock clicks. And you are left standing entirely alone in the center of a freezing, echoing museum of your own shattered future. In the agonizing spring of 2009, Liam Neeson found himself standing in the center of that unbearable silence. He was 56 years old. He had just buried the absolute love of his life. He was suddenly a single father, tasked with the overwhelming, impossible responsibility of raising two grieving teenage boys, Michael and Daniel, who had just lost their mother to a freak, incomprehensible accident. When a human heart is violently broken to that magnitude, the brain desperately seeks a survival mechanism. If Liam sat in that beautiful, quiet farmhouse in upstate New York, if he allowed his mind to linger on Natasha's clothes, still hanging in the closet, or the lingering scent of her perfume on the pillows, the sheer, suffocating gravity of the grief would have undoubtedly drowned him. He needed an escape. He needed an environment so incredibly loud, so physically demanding, and so completely exhausting that his brain would simply not have the capacity to process the empty space in his bed. Right around the time of Natasha's passing, a modest, relatively low-budget European thriller hit theaters in the United States. The film was taken. Liam had accepted the role of Brian Mills, a retired intelligence agent with a very particular set of skills who ruthlessly hunts down the men who kidnapped his daughter, assuming it would go straight to DVD. He took the job because it offered a free trip to Paris and a chance to learn some basic fight choreography. But the universe operated with its trademark, terrifying sense of dramatic irony, turned the film into a massive, unexpected global phenomenon. Audiences were absolutely mesmerized. They didn't just see an action hero. They saw a towering 6'4" patriarch who projected a terrifying, authentic, and completely unyielding devotion to protecting his family. Taken grossed nearly $250 million. And overnight, at the astonishing age of 56, the Oscar-nominated classical Shakespearean actor was suddenly crowned as the most lethal, bankable action star on the entire planet. What followed over the next decade is one of the most profound, deeply misunderstood psychological chapters in the history of modern cinema. Following the death of his wife, Liam Neeson did not retreat. He threw himself into the newly discovered action genre with a manic, obsessive, and almost suicidal level of dedication. He signed on to star in a relentless, punishing string of violent, high-octane thrillers, Unknown, The Grey, Nonstop, A Walk Among the Tombstones, and multiple sequels to Taken. The media and the critics marveled at his late-in-life physical renaissance. They praised his incredible work ethic. They called it a brilliant career pivot. But they completely missed the dark, agonizing truth hiding behind the choreographed fight scenes. Liam Neeson was not making those movies for the money. He was not making them to win awards. He was making them because physical exhaustion was the only effective anesthetic available to him. Imagine the sheer, heartbreaking reality of his existence during those years. He was a man approaching his 60s. He was throwing his massive frame against concrete walls, taking physical beatings from stuntmen half his age, engaging in exhausting 12-hour days of relentless combat choreography. Why? Because when your body is screaming in absolute physical agony, your mind is momentarily distracted from the emotional agony. He was bruising his own ribs just to give his broken heart a few hours of sleep. Reflecting on his desperate, relentless need to keep the cameras rolling in the aftermath of the tragedy, Liam stripped away the Hollywood bravado and delivered a quote that strikes at the very core of a widower's survival. "I'm not good without work," he confessed quietly, his deep voice carrying the heavy, unvarnished exhaustion of a man who was running from a ghost. "I just didn't want to, especially for my boys, seem to be wallowing in sadness or depression. I had to keep moving. I had to keep moving." Listen to the breathtaking, tragic stoicism in those words. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who had lost a spouse and subsequently buried themselves in 80-hour work weeks, taking extra shifts or obsessively cleaning the house just to avoid sitting still in the deafening quiet, Liam's frantic work ethic is deeply, painfully understood. But the psychological paradox of his new career went infinitely deeper than just physical exhaustion. Look closely at the specific kind of characters he was choosing to play. In the Taken franchise, he plays a father who possesses the ultimate ability to track down the people who hurt his family and exact absolute, terrifying vengeance upon them. In the magnificent, incredibly bleak 2011 survival film Grey, he plays a grieving widower, stranded in the freezing Alaskan wilderness, who physically fights off a pack of wolves while haunted by the memory of his dying wife. He was essentially acting out his own internal psychological warfare on screen. In the cinema, he was the master of his universe. He was a god of retribution. If someone took his family, he had the skills to get them back. He could shoot the bad guys. He could rewrite the ending. He could save the day. But the crushing, unbearable tragedy of his reality was that Natasha was not taken by a cinematic villain. She was taken by a microscopic, invisible hemorrhage on a peaceful ski slope. There was no villain to punch. There was no enemy to track down. There was absolutely nothing his 6'4" frame or his magnificent voice could do to reverse the cruel mathematics of the universe. He was playing the ultimate savior on the silver screen, precisely because he had been completely, tragically powerless to be a savior in his own life. He took his own intensely private despair, and he performed an absolute miracle of artistic alchemy. He weaponized his heartbreak. When you watch Liam Neeson glaring into a camera lens, projecting that terrifying, cold, and utterly exhausted fury, you are not watching a man pretending to be angry. You are watching a widower pouring his actual, genuine rage against the unfairness of the universe directly onto the celluloid. He became the undisputed, reigning king of the global box office. He secured a massive multi-million-dollar fortune for his sons. He achieved a level of fame that most actors cannot even fathom. But at the end of every exhausting, physically punishing day of shooting, the director would yell cut, the stuntmen would go home, the bright studio lights would be turned off, and the towering, invincible action god would have to walk back to his trailer, take off his costume, and unlock the door to a quiet, empty hotel room. He had successfully entertained billions of strangers, but he was still entirely alone in the dark. As he navigated through his 60s, the adrenaline of the action movies began to wear off. The physical toll on his aging body was accumulating, and the deafening noise of the Hollywood machinery could no longer drown out the quiet, persistent ghosts waiting for him back at the farmhouse in New York. The ultimate protector was about to realize that you cannot punch your way out of grief. He was going to have to finally stop running, put down his weapons, and learn how to sit in the absolute silence of the empty house. The empty house, the echoes of grief, and the unseen waves. There's a highly predictable, almost mechanically cynical script that plays out when an A-list, multimillionaire Hollywood leading man suddenly finds himself single. The industry expects him to quickly process his grief in front of a sympathetic magazine cover, to embark on a highly publicized, healing journey, and within a year or two, to emerge on a red carpet with a significantly younger, glamorous companion on his arm. It is the established algorithm of celebrity survival. It dictates that emptiness must be immediately filled, and that silence must be aggressively drowned out by new noise. But Liam Neeson, the towering, soft-spoken giant from Ballymena, Northern Ireland, completely and fundamentally rejected the Hollywood algorithm. Following the devastating, unspeakable tragedy of Natasha's passing in 2009, he did not fill his massive, beautiful farmhouse in Millbrook, New York, with new noise. He did not chase the superficial distractions of the Los Angeles dating scene. Instead, he essentially transformed himself into a solitary, fiercely protective guardian of a shrine. He was a 56-year-old widower when the accident occurred, and for the next decade and a half, as he successfully transitioned into his 60s and marched steadily toward the 70s, the global box office continued to crown him as a king. But behind the heavy, oak doors of his private sanctuary, Liam remained a profoundly single, profoundly devoted father to his two deeply grieving teenage boys, Michael and Daniel. He took on the impossible, agonizing task of being both the unyielding, strong patriarch and the soft, nurturing mother to two children whose entire universe had been ripped apart on a ski slope. He attended their soccer games. He cooked their meals. He navigated the terrifying, explosive complexities of teenage grief entirely on his own, ensuring that despite the massive, crushing crater left by Natasha's absence, the boys still felt the unbreakable, absolute security of a home. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men who have had to bury the women who organized their lives, or the women who watched their fathers silently carry the heavy burden of a widower's reality, Liam's quiet endurance is an absolute masterclass in old-school, honorable dignity. He did not seek pity. He simply stood in the breach, absorbing the shockwaves of the tragedy so his sons could eventually learn how to stand up straight again. But true grief is not a linear, manageable process. It does not obey a timeline, and it certainly does not care how many billions of dollars your movies have grossed. Grief is a ghost that lives permanently inside the house. For years, the media respectfully allowed Liam to maintain a dignified silence regarding the exact daily mechanics of his mourning. But in 2014, 5 long, grueling years after Natasha had slipped across the threshold in that sterile Montreal hospital room, the notoriously private actor sat down for a rare, deeply intimate interview with 60 Minutes. He was asked about the reality of outliving the love of his life, and what he delivered was not a polished, PR-proof soundbite. It was an incredibly raw, bleeding, and profoundly poetic description of what it actually means to carry a broken heart. Her death was never real, Liam confessed, his deep, resonant voice trembling with a startling vulnerability that completely erased the tough guy image of Taken. It still kind of isn't. There's periods now in our New York residence when I hear the door opening, especially the first couple of years. Anytime I hear that door opening, I still think I'm going to hear her. Listen to the absolute, breathtaking devastation of that admission. Imagine the sheer psychological torture being a 62-year-old man, sitting quietly in your living room, reading a script or drinking a cup of coffee. The front door clicks. A gust of wind blows through the house. And for one single, miraculous, agonizing fraction of a second, your brain tricks you into believing that the last 5 years were just a terrible nightmare. You believe she is finally home. And then a millisecond later, the brutal, unyielding reality of the universe crashes back down upon you, and you are forced to bury your wife all over again. Grief is like a wave, Liam continued, providing what is perhaps the most accurate, devastating metaphor ever spoken by an actor. You just get this profound feeling of instability. The earth isn't stable anymore. Then it passes and it becomes more infrequent, but I still get it sometimes. That wave of profound instability, that sudden, terrifying realization that the earth is no longer solid, is the exact, brutal tax demanded by true love. Liam Neeson proved that he was not a machine. The man who could disarm a dozen mercenaries in a cinematic alleyway was completely defenseless against a memory triggered by the creak of a wooden floorboard. As the 2010s faded and the calendar turned into the early 2020s, Liam Neeson entered his 70s. He was incredibly wealthy. His sons, Michael and Daniel, had grown into remarkable, successful young men. Michael even changed his last name to Richardson, a profoundly beautiful, touching tribute to ensure that his mother's legacy would permanently continue in the family line. Liam had successfully guided them through the fire, and they had emerged intact. But as the demanding, physically punishing era of his action's superstardom began to inevitably slow down, the aging giant found himself standing on a completely different kind of precipice. The adrenaline of the movie sets was wearing off. The distraction of constant, manic work was no longer physically sustainable for a man in his 70s. The body that had once boxed in the rough streets of Bulimia, the shoulders that had carried the crushing weight of Schindler's List, and the fists that had punched through the Taken franchise were beginning to demand rest. He was 70 years old, and he was staring out at the vast, quiet horizon of a life that he was still, fundamentally, walking through entirely alone. He had survived the poverty. He had survived the 30 years of Hollywood rejection. He had survived the catastrophic, senseless death of his wife. And he had survived the agonizing, exhausting task of single fatherhood. But the universe, which had stripped him of his most precious anchor, was finally preparing to grant the exhausted warrior a profound, ultimate kind of peace. The man who had spent his entire life protecting other people on screen was about to realize that the most courageous act of his entire existence was simply allowing himself to stop fighting, put down his weapons, and make peace with the ghosts that shared his home. The final, quietest chapter of the legend was beginning, and the towering, gentle giant of cinema was about to deliver his most profound, unspoken lesson to a world that had completely forgotten how to grieve with dignity. The gentle giant, the grace of aging, and the final piece. There is a magnificent, rarely discussed bravery in the act of simply slowing down. For a man who has spent 15 years running at absolute, breakneck speed to escape the terrifying silence of an empty house, the decision to finally stop running requires infinitely more courage than stepping into a boxing ring. As the calendar pushed past the dawn of the 2020s, and the world marched steadily toward the year 2026, Liam Neeson crossed the threshold of his 73rd birthday. The physical realities of 73 years on Earth, compounded by the heavy, invisible mileage of a broken heart, were becoming impossible to ignore. The man who had single-handedly redefined the modern action genre, who had thrown his towering 6'4" frame through thousands of choreographed fights, shattered windows, and exhausting night shoots, began to quietly acknowledge the undeniable, unyielding mathematics of human biology. In an industry utterly terrified of aging, an industry where men in their 70s routinely dye their hair, undergo artificial preservation, and desperately cling to the illusions of their youth, Liam Neeson chose an incredibly radical, beautiful path. He chose to age with absolute, unapologetic dignity. In recent interviews, the aging titan spoke about his departure from the action genre not with bitterness, but with profound, self-deprecating humor and a majestic acceptance of reality. He realized that watching a man in his 70s effortlessly defeat armies of young mercenaries was stretching the boundaries of cinematic belief. "I'm getting away with it by the skin of my teeth," Liam confessed, flashing that familiar, warm, and deeply seasoned smile. There's a point where the audience goes, "Oh, come on." You can't fool audiences. I don't want to be fighting 20-year-old guys anymore. It's time to hang up the particular set of skills. Listen to the breathtaking, quiet relief hidden inside that surrender. For the audiences watching this, especially those who have reached the autumn of their lives and finally realize that they no longer need to prove their strength to the world, Liam's retirement from the action genre is an incredibly beautiful, spiritual milestone. He wasn't just hanging up the cinematic weapons. He was putting down the heavy, exhausting anesthetic he had been using to numb his grief since 2009. He no longer needed the deafening explosions of the movies set to drown out the quiet of his farmhouse in New York. After 15 years of wrestling with the ghost of his beloved Natasha in the dark, the fierce, agonizing hurricane of loss had finally settled into a deep, manageable, and profoundly peaceful ocean. He had survived the impossible. When you look at Liam Neeson today, standing tall with his magnificent shock of silver hair, his deep-set eyes carrying the beautiful, weathered map of his 73 years, you are not looking at a Hollywood superhero. You are looking at an incredibly resilient, deeply successful patriarch. His two sons, Michael and Daniel, are now fully grown, brilliant, and fiercely independent men. They survived the catastrophic, world-shattering loss of their mother because their father stood like an immovable mountain in the center of their shattered universe, absorbing the worst of the shockwaves, so they could eventually learn how to stand up straight. Liam did not save his wife from that tragic, invisible hemorrhage on the Canadian ski slope. He could not bend the universe to his will, but he achieved a victory that is infinitely more permanent and profoundly more meaningful than any fictional rescue. He saved her memory. He protected the brilliant, beautiful legacy of Natasha Richardson, ensuring that her light continued to burn brightly within the hearts of the two boys she left behind. He proved that true, legendary masculinity is not about never crying. It is not about harboring a heart of stone, and it is certainly not about punishing the world for your own suffering. True masculinity, the absolute highest form of human strength, is carrying a graveyard inside your chest, carrying the heavy, unbearable absence of the woman you loved, and still choosing to treat the world with breathtaking, unwavering gentleness. The boy from the rough, working-class streets of Belimina, the kid who had his nose broken in a boxing ring, had spent his entire life mastering the art of fight. He had fought poverty. He had fought the incredibly prejudiced, cynical casting directors of Hollywood. He had fought for the defining role of Oscar Schindler. And he had fought a desperate, exhausting war against his own grief. But as the twilight of his magnificent career bathes his legacy in a warm, golden glow, the fighting is finally over. The giant from Northern Ireland has absolutely nothing left to prove. The Oscar nominations, the billion-dollar box office receipts, and the global adoration will echo through the archives of cinema forever. But his true masterpiece was never captured on 35mm film. His masterpiece was a quiet, unseen courage it took to wake up every single morning in an empty house, put his feet on the floor, and keep walking forward for his sons. Liam Neeson is the ultimate protector, the reluctant action star, the Shakespearean poet trapped in the body of a gladiator. And as he steps away from a noise, walking quietly into serene, incredibly well-deserved peace of his 70s, he leaves us with the ultimate immortal lesson. The greatest power a man can possess is not the ability to destroy his enemies. It is a profound, beautiful capacity to outlive his tragedies, to carry the ghosts of the people he loved with absolute honor, and to finally, gracefully, enjoy the silence. As we close the book on a heartbreaking, immensely powerful, and ultimately beautiful journey of Liam Neeson, the camera turns away from the Hollywood legend, and it focuses deeply, gently on you. Liam's story is a profound reminder that grief is not something we simply get over. It is a heavy, invisible weight that we learn to carry with dignity. He showed us that even when the universe cruelly steals our most precious anchor, we can still find the strength to stand tall, protect the people who remain, and eventually find peace in the quiet. What about you? When you experienced a loss that completely shattered your world, how did you find the strength to keep walking forward? Who was the anchor that kept you grounded when the storm was at its worst? Please, take a moment to share your stories of survival, your beautiful memories of loved ones, and your hard-earned wisdom in the comments below. Your journey of healing might be exactly the beacon of light someone else needs to see today. If this story of untamed resilience and enduring love moved you, please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more deep, unfiltered stories behind the legends we love. Thank you for your time. Hold your family close, cherish the memories, and until next time, keep moving forward.